I just can't wait to hear what I have to say. It's true because I've never, ever spoken on Isaiah 53 in my life. And I feel, especially as a Hebrew professor, it's such an omission, a bracket in like things I obviously should have done. But because of our brother's kind invitation, this information is fresh. And your handout could even still be warm from the printer. It's that fresh. And I look forward to learning with you through these 4 sessions I will have with you tonight, 1, 2, tomorrow, and then again. Oh, and speaking of those hot off the press handouts, here they come. Well, on one occasion, I remember being at Moody Bible Institute on faculty, and we would go out speaking on the weekends, sometimes in churches where the bulletin would, list all the songs and then what to expect, so no one was caught off guard with things that actually happen every week. And then, except that it said next to the message, my name. And this kid, he kind of blurted out, "Oh no, not Dr. Sigler. He's the most boring lecturer we have." And the woman next to him said, "Do you know who I am?" And he said, "No." And she said, "Well, I'm his wife." And so I just want you to know my wife is here with me today, Bernice. And so if you're going to give negative feedback, don't give it to her. So the student said, "Well, do you know who I am?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Good, see ya." And he was out of there. And so I look forward to getting to know some of you, hopefully not like that. We have the privilege of being the parents of 3 young adult children who all love Yeshua and love us, and we're trying not to mess that up. We had the privilege of FaceTiming with them in the last hours. We're grateful for them, for their love for the Lord, and their love for us. We, as a family, had one of those amazing privileges during my time on faculty at Moody. We were granted a sabbatical, actually twice during my long career there. Twice. I had an entire academic year off. Now, granted, it's not vacation. It's that you have to promise the world, like you're going to write these articles and you're going to prep these new courses and you're going to change the world and come back ready to serve them better for another 7 years. And by God's grace, that's kind of how it worked. We moved to Israel. And we tossed our young kids into the deep end of the pool, לבית ספר ישראלי, to an Israeli school, איפה שהם רק דיברו בעברית, where they only spoke Hebrew, and הם בכו משהו כ4 חודשים. They cried something like 4 months. But then they cried in Hebrew. And I said, "See how fun it is to be bilingual?" And now they speak Hebrew at home. And even yesterday, we had the privilege, or was it this morning? I can't even remember. But we were in Sydney for a few days before flying here this afternoon. And there we were near the pool. And our daughter called us. And she was speaking Hebrew and wanted to know something. And I'm answering her. And you could see the light on this lady's face. She looked so excited, and she said, "It just touched me to hear you speaking Hebrew." And then she began speaking Hebrew to me, and we had just met an Arabic-speaking woman who was a believer, a born-again Arab Christian. And I speak a little Arabic too because I got tired of the bus drivers speaking and I couldn't understand them on the tours in Israel, so why not learn a little Arabic? And so we were speaking some Arabic before, and then she told me, maybe God brought you here for such a time as this to speak to her in Hebrew and tell her the gospel. And I thought, yeah, you're probably right. And so I went back and I had the opportunity to share the gospel with her in Hebrew there poolside in Sydney yesterday. Well, it's a privilege to live and study about the land of Israel and then to follow in the footsteps of our beloved brother who this summer we were traveling the land a bit, and Arnold Fruchtenbaum had requested earlier in the year a special assignment. He invited me to San Antonio for 3 days, and I thought, 3 days? That's not just a cup of coffee. I wonder what we're going to talk about. And I asked someone, do you know why Arnold wants me to come to San Antonio? She said, well, you know, he's not getting any younger. He did turn 80 in September. And we have been praying, she said. We've been praying for 20 years for his successor. I thought, oh, that's not just coffee. And so when I went to meet with him, it was quite the privilege for him to share the history of Ariel Ministries, to learn that it was more than just Arnold. I had no idea. But there are over 10 global branches, even here in Australia. And I'm getting to know some of these wonderful people even tonight for the first time in person. And then there are publications. Arnold's written over 25 books. Many people have been encouraged by his Bible teachings throughout the year. And the ministry continues to grow. Camp Shoshana will celebrate its 50th anniversary in the coming year. But of course, there's also a college. I learned that I'm now the president of it. And arielcollege.org. You can look it up with online courses about many topics. An increasing number of courses are available. Books and commentaries, online courses, and of course we'll continue hosting study tours to Israel, which I have to do. Like, that's also a part of the job. So praise God for the opportunity at Ariel Ministries. I want to be the Lord's servant to faithfully carry the baton that Arnold will pass to me at the 50th anniversary of the camp next summer in September. I mentioned to someone when they asked me, what's your vision for Ariel Ministries? I said, well, you know, D.L. Moody founded that Bible Institute in Chicago, and then someone followed him that you probably have no idea that person's name. But they must have been faithful because there's still a Moody Bible Institute. And I would like to be that faithful person who could follow the founder and maintain the doctrinal purity and the ministry integrity of Ariel Ministries for this new season, to God's glory. Well, speaking of being a servant, we turn our attention to the topic of the evening and the weekend. Behold, my servant. You see, 4 passages in Isaiah chapters 40 to 55 have been identified as songs celebrating the sacrificial life of a righteous servant of God who brings about the redemption of others. And these songs, they are found in Isaiah chapter 42, 1 through 9, 49, 1 through 13, 50, verses 4 through 11, and finally, over a 2-chapter unit, chapter 52, verse 13 to 53, 12. These songs, as we see, come at a point in the book that would be all in the 3rd section, if you will. Chapters 1 through 35 deal with prophecies of condemnation or judgment. You could look time after time after time in these first 35 chapters and get rather depressed about Israel's sin, about the discipline that the Lord is bringing upon them through foreign enemy nations. There are all of these woes, these judgments that are spoken time after time after time. It's like a whole batch of songs on a playlist that are all depressing. That's pretty much what you find in the first chapters of the book of Isaiah. And then you get this section 2, chapters 36 to 39, which some scholars have called the book of Hezekiah, because they're all dealing with the life and reign of this king who needed to trust in the Lord. He should trust in the Lord. He's doubtful, though. The enemies are round about and the pressure is on. Hezekiah, will he trust in the Lord? He's kind of teeter-tottering personally, but that's kind of where these chapters fit in the book. They're the hinge, if you will, that bring you to chapters 40 to 66, and the mood suddenly changes. Instead of oy vavoy lacha, instead of oh no for you, it's nachmu, nachmu et ami. Comfort, comfort ye, my people. It's a complete and utter change, so much so that critical scholars who are not Bible believers look at this and say, there must be a different author entirely. It can't be the same person even writing chapters 1 through 39 that writes chapters 40 through 66. So there must be first Isaiah and second Isaiah, a completely different author. And then I think, you really have to be a critical scholar to think that authors can't have more than one mood. I mean, have you ever been watching your young kids while they're doing something crazy and you're yelling at them and telling them stop, and then the phone rings and you're like, hi, how you doing? Great to hear from you. You know, like, but you were just yelling at the top of your lungs a few minutes ago. Like, you're the same person. This same prophet writes both the words of the Lord's judgment against disobedient Israel and the Lord's comfort to Israel despite her disobedience. And in these chapters, in the third section, you find 4 servant songs. The historical context of the book relates really to what has been called the Syro-Ephraimite War, where the main character is another king of Judah, Ahaz, who's, well, surrounded by his fellow Jewish relatives to the north, the northern tribes, led by the Ephraimite king, which, by the way, Ephraim is the favorite name of the prophet Isaiah for all the northern tribes, because Ephraim was one of the most fruitful. That's what the word Ephraim means. It was one of the most powerful of the northern tribes. So all the northern tribes, Israel, if you will, in the north, Judah in the south, Isaiah's favorite name for Israel, or for, the northern tribes will be Ephraim. So you have Pekah, the king of Israel, or the king of the Ephraimite tribes to the north, and then further north and to the to the east would be, in modern-day Syria, ancient Aram. Aram, with its capital then, just as now, in Damascus, you have Rezin, the king of Aram in Damascus. Now, in addition to these kings, there's a much bigger king. A king, you could say, of other kingdoms, an emperor. And this would be Tiglath-Pileser III. Don't say that too quickly. I like to just call him by his rap star name, TP3, but because I can spell that. And so Tiglath-Pileser III, he's the king of Assyria. And maybe if you can't remember that Assyria is the big kingdom, the big empire, just look inside the word Assyria and you see the smaller kingdom, Syria. See? That's the smaller kingdom. Assyria, the bigger word, is the bigger kingdom. It's ruling multiple kingdoms and in fact was receiving tribute, in other words, collecting taxes from both Israel and Judah and the Arameans in Syria. So this is the background. Here you see what could be called the Assyrian Empire of the day. In fact, the woman we met at the hotel who spoke Arabic and was a born-again believer in Jesus, she's Assyrian background. I saw her wearing a cross, but I heard her speaking Arabic, and so I couldn't help myself. And there we were. She shared her testimony a bit, and told about her Assyrian background. She immigrated to Australia from Iraq, and we were, off to the races learning about her history. But it's this same similar Assyrian Empire history. I remember the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, where I would take our students twice every semester for nearly 18 years at Moody Bible Institute. The University of Chicago was not attempting to hold a museum of biblical artifacts, but because this institute focused on that part of the world, well, almost everything relates to the Bible. And so it was like, thank you very much, University of Chicago, for providing all these first-hand biblical artifacts for our students to come down a few blocks and every semester learn about the culture and the world of the Bible. This area of Assyria, notice that its empire stretches all the way almost into Egypt. And that is one reason that the Assyrians so desperately wanted to have allegiance from these three smaller kingdoms of Syria, Israel, and then to the far south, Judah, to make sure that there was a pact, a league, so that if the Egyptians were to try to stretch their power northward in the Fertile Crescent, at least the Judahites and the Israelites and the Syrians would be there to hold them back until all the other Assyrian forces could get there and hold them off. And thus, when we come to this book of Isaiah, we're looking at a time in the nation of Israel's history that is actually quite similar in its mood and tensions to what the nation of Israel is facing today and the Jewish people worldwide. We're looking at a time today of threats from enemy nations, of political division within, of death and destruction that is just looming off in the distance, where if those who would have their way, you know what they would do to the Jewish people? They say it out loud, and you can hear them from the river to the sea. Did you know that just the other day, some Jewish attorney in New Jersey sought to copyright those words? Maybe he'll succeed, and therefore anyone who wants to say it will have to pay him royalties. Now that's a pretty good trick. When we think of this historical background to the tension and difficulties that the nation and people of Israel are facing today, and the tension and difficulties that the nation faced some 700 years before the time of Yeshua, we're looking at a world into which God's message of salvation needs to be heard. And God's message of salvation was foretold as the prophet would speak about a person called God's servant, the Eved Adonai, the servant of the Lord. And so in 4 songs, the final of which will be our focus through the weekend, we find the context for what will be Isaiah 53. But before we get there, let's look at a little bit of the background to the other servant songs as we lead up to the ultimate servant song, the 4th. The first of 4 servant songs comes in chapter 42, verses 1 through 9, where we read, "Behold, my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my ruach, my spirit on him. He will bring justice to the nations. He will not cry out or raise his voice or make his voice heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out." In other words, speaking about the nation as a whole that was about to be destroyed by others. No. This servant of the Lord is not going to mistreat suffering Israel. He's going to bring hope to suffering Israel. He, verse 4, will not be disheartened or crushed until he establishes justice on earth. The islands will wait for his Torah. Thus says God, Adonai, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it, and ruach, or spirit, to those who walk in it. I, Adonai, called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations, by opening blind eyes, bringing prisoners out of the dungeon and those sitting in darkness out of the prison house. I am Adonai, this is my name. My glory I will not give to another, or my praise to graven images. Behold, the former things have come to pass. Now I declare new things before they spring forth. I announce them to you. God's commission to his servant and what this servant will accomplish is first announced here in Isaiah chapter 42. This is the first song speaking of the servant of the Lord. But the second servant song comes to us in Isaiah 49, verses 1 through 13, where we see the servant's discouragement and then God's answer to that discouragement, and then the rejection and exaltation of the servant, but finally the restoration by the servant. Let's look at these words in chapter 49. Listen to me, islands. Pay attention, peoples far away. Adonai called me from the womb, from my mother's belly. He named me. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. He has hidden me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing in futility. Yet surely the justice due to me is with Adonai, and my reward with my God. So now, says Adonai, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, to gather Israel back to him, for I am honored in the eyes of Adonai, and my God has become my strength. So he says, it is too trifling a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the preserved ones of Israel. So I will give you as a light to the nations, that you should be my salvation to the end of the earth. Thus says Adonai, the Redeemer of Israel, their Holy One, to the one despised and the one to the nations, to the one the nations a nation abhors, to a servant of rulers. Kings will see and arise. Princes will also bow down because of Adonai, who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, who has chosen you. Thus says Adonai, in a time of favor I will answer you. In a day of salvation I will help you. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, to restore the land, to make them possess its desolate inheritances, saying to the prisoners, come out, and to those in darkness, be shown. Along the roads they will graze. Their pasture will be on all the barren heights. They will not hunger or thirst, nor scorching wind or sun strike them, for their compassionate one will lead them and guide them by springs of water. I will make all my mountains a road, and my highways will be raised up. Behold, these shall come from afar. Behold, these shall come from the north and from the west and from the land of Sinim. By the way, this word sinim is the same root from which in modern Hebrew, sin, is China. In other words, wherever this is, and Bible translations go in a lot of different directions with translating this word, it's a long way from home. And God is going to take those who have been scattered, no matter how far away, and bring them back. We continue reading here about this regathering in verse 13. Shout for joy, heavens. Rejoice, earth. Break forth into ringing shouts, O mountains. For Adonai has comforted his people and has compassion on his afflicted. Here, this second servant song then transforms the discouragement into encouragement. Even with words that seem so prescient of our moment to this very day about the return of captives, there is hope that is offered from the servant of the Lord. And now we turn to the third servant song in Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 through 11, the sufferings of the servant. And we begin to see how this song is broken up in these units of verses 1 through 3, the separation of the Lord and his unfaithful wife Israel, the servant of the Lord, verses 4 through 9, and then the message to believers and unbelievers, a warning and encouragement in verses 10 and 11. So take a look. Adonai Elohim has given me the tongue of the learned, that I may know how to sustain the weary with the word. He awakens me morning by morning. He awakens my ear to give heed as a disciple. Adonai Elohim has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious, nor did I turn back. I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those pulling out my beard. I did not hide my face from humiliation and spitting. For Adonai Elohim will help me. Therefore I have not been disgraced. Therefore I set my face like flint, and I know that I will not be ashamed. The one who vindicates me is near. Who will accuse me? Let us stand up to each other. Who is my adversary? Let him confront me. See, Adonai Elohim will help me. Who is he who will condemn me? See, they all wear out like a garment. A moth will eat them up. Who among you fears Adonai? Who fears the voice of his servant? Who walks in darkness and has no light? Let him trust in the name of Adonai and lean on his God. Behold, all you who kindle a fire, encircling yourself with firebrands, walk in the light of your fire, and among the brands you have lit. This you will have from my hand. You will lie down in torment. Wow, these words of judgment that conclude this third and final song is a warning to all who rebel against the Lord and will not receive his light. They're going to receive a fire that brings no light, and it will be a torment as they turn against him. We come to the fourth and final song that deals so graphically with the issues of death and even of burial, and yet of resurrection. All of these included in chapter 52, verse 13 through 53, verse 12, where there is a prophecy that my servant shall prosper. And there's the question in the opening verses of chapter 53, who has believed my report? Who has believed our message? Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Someone understands the affliction of the people of Israel. Someone truly cares and can relate to this suffering himself. It's God's servant who can truly relate. In fact, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him, and he put him to grief. Let's take a look at this fourth and final song. Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as many were appalled at you, his appearance was disfigured more than any man, his form more than the sons of men. So he will sprinkle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what had not been told them, they will see. And what they had not heard, they will perceive. Who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of Adonai been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nor beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, one from whom people hid their faces. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our pains. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced because of our transgressions, crushed because of our iniquities. The chastisement of our shalom was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray, each of us turned to his own way. So Adonai has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Because of oppression and judgment, he was taken away. As for his generation, who considered? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people, the stroke was theirs. His grave was given to the wicked, and by a rich man in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased Adonai to bruise him. He caused him to suffer. If he makes his soul a guilt offering, he will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the will of Adonai will succeed by his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied by his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, will make many righteous, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion with the great, and he will divide the spoil with the mighty, because he poured out his soul to death and was counted with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. Friends, as we read these words often omitted in the traditional liturgy of the synagogue, not a part of the traditional reading of Haftorot, or these portions that are read in unison with and alongside, paralleling various parashiot or Torah portions of the week, we begin to see in these four servant songs a very important set of prophecies. In fact, when we look at the four songs together, even for just a moment, we would notice some similarities between the first and the fourth, the second and the third. Perhaps you could do some grammatical investigation yourself. Having this sheet provided for you, you might take some time over the weekend to do some highlighting, circling, underlining, however you like to mark up the page, and you would observe that the pronouns in Song 1 and Song 4 are often in the third person, speaking of he or him or his. Whereas in Songs 2 and 3, the pronouns are often in the first person. I, me, and my. Perhaps this begins to help us consider the major question of the weekend. What servant are we talking about? Who is this servant? Who is the servant of the book of Isaiah? And ultimately, since chapter 53 really gets deep into a prediction and prophecy about someone who's going to do something for someone, and who's going to do what, and who is the suffering servant of Isaiah 53? Perhaps simply looking at the grammar of the text will help us answer that question. Further, we would notice the similarities between Song 1 and Song 4, that they both are introduced, and you can see it here clearly in the text that is provided for you, the first words of chapter 42 and chapter 52, verse 13 are, behold, my servant. Whereas the middle two songs, Song 2 and 3, they do not have this introduction, behold my servant. Instead, you have a common mention of the Lord, or the Lord God, Adonai, Elohim. The Lord is ultimately going to cause all of Israel to behold his servant. And thus, these songs set us up to want to ask that question about the Lord's servant. By the way, the term servant has been used already in the book a number of times, but only 3 times in chapters 1 through 40. And each one of those times that is used in chapters 1 through 40, it is specified exactly who that servant is. Take a look, for instance, at Isaiah chapter 20, verse 3. And the Lord said, even as my servant Isaiah has gone naked and barefoot 3 years as a sign and token against Egypt and Cush. By the way, the Lord occasionally called his prophets to do some terrible things, which would cause someone maybe not to want to be his servant. I mean, think of his call to Hosea to marry Gomer. Look, even if she weren't a prostitute, just the name Gomer, it's kind of a turnoff. But then to have to illustrate for Isaiah the shame of disobedient Israel by walking around in his own nakedness, shame. Here, the servant is identified in Isaiah 20, verse 3. But further in Isaiah 22, verse 20. Then it will come about in that day that I will summon my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah. What? Here it tells who the servant is. And finally, in Isaiah 37, verse 35, for I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. So it says servant 3 times in chapters 1 through 40. Each time it tells exactly who the servant is. And we have to contrast that with the fact that in the rest of the book, the word is used 12 times in just this section of the servant songs, chapters 41 to 53. Here, we're going to see that sometimes the term servant relates to Israel. Sometimes it relates to a righteous remnant within Israel. And sometimes it seems to suggest there is one individual, singular Israelite who is faithful to God as his servant, ultimately the Messiah. One last chart. In chapters 41 to 53, my servant is either going to be seen as Israel as the servant, and more often, the second person pronouns will be used. Thee, thou, thy, we often don't use this in modern English, but you are hearing a lot more about pronouns these days. You might as well learn some biblical ones. And these second person pronouns speak to the nation, often characterizing the nation by its failure. However, also in these chapters, there are times when you hear of an individual servant. This is most often in the third and first person. He, him, his, or me, I, my. And again, I provided these texts written out so that perhaps you might want to do some of your own grammatical analysis. Begin marking it up, analyzing the text so that you might answer the question for yourself. Read it. I mean, this is the reason why many people don't believe the Bible. They've never read the Bible. Give it a try. What you might find is that this individual servant, often spoken of in the third and first person, is often characterized not by failure, but by success. That God, through this special servant, is going to accomplish his divine purposes. Throughout our times together, our 4 sessions that I'll have with you, I'd like to introduce you to an Israeli friend. Her name is Rivka. To fast forward in her story, she is a graduate of the Moody Bible Institute, and she teaches today at a Messianic school near Tiberias in Israel. I often take my tour groups not only to see the ancient archaeological artifacts, and some people really dig archaeology, but I also like to take them, thank you, I also like to take them to see the living stones of Israel. And we often find ourselves in the garden behind Rivka and her husband's home, where to each of our groups, maybe 40 people, she will share her salvation testimony and how a particular challenge came her way when the Ministry of Education of the entire state of Israel demanded that every graduating senior would write their final research paper on the subject, who is the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. I'd like you to hear her story in 4 5-minute segments and to be introduced to the first one now. And in conclusion,
I was born and raised in Kibbutz Elonim in the Jezreel Valley. Both my parents grew up in somewhat religious homes, but rebelled against their upbringing and became Zionists, whose religion was to work the land and establish Israel as a country, as an independent country. So I grew up in a very secular society. But as Jews, we had to study the Bible from 2nd grade on to 12th grade. When I was in my 8th grade, I started asking questions about the existence of God, and I really wanted to know, does God exist or not? Now, in Israel, you're not supposed to say the most holy name of God, Yehovah. So I decided to test God and say his name and see if something happens in nature. I said it quietly, waited, nothing happened. Said it again and again and again, even louder, and nothing happened in nature. So I thought, wow, God does not exist. But after a while, I thought this was not a really good test. Maybe it doesn't bother God. So one day I said to God, I don't believe you exist. But if you do, by any chance, reveal yourself to me. Now I'm going to give you a chance to speak to me. I'm going to read the Old Testament again. So it took me about a year to get through the Old Testament. And when I finished, I decided that God existed for 2 reasons. Number 1, the story of creation seemed more reasonable than the story of evolution. And then I saw how God took for himself a people through Abraham and promised him a land and descendants and blessings. And now, some 4,000 years after that fact, we have our own independent country, despite of the numerous attempts to annihilate the Jewish people. It started with Pharaoh, Haman, Nebuchadnezzar, the Greeks, the Romans, the Inquisition, the Arabs, the Holocaust, you name it. Everybody and their brother want to kill us. Yet we have our own country. So for that fact alone, I started to believe in the existence of God. Now, I was very happy to have found an answer for that, but something was missing for that face of God, and I didn't know what I was looking for. So because I'm Jewish, I went first to Judaism. I took my Passover vacation and I went to a yeshiva in Tzfat, Chabad Yeshiva. After being there for 2 weeks, all I could find there was a lot of do's and don'ts that did not appeal to a 15-year-old girl who grew up in a kibbutz. I explored a little bit into Eastern mysticism, but I found that to be very empty religion. Now, in the kibbutz, all the teenagers had to work 1 day a week somewhere in the kibbutz, and my job was in the factory for anodizing aluminum. With me worked one of the volunteers who came from America, and he was very different from everyone else. He was the best worker. He never complained. He was very happy all the time. He went around the kibbutz doing good deeds like weeding people's gardens or making stands for people who made sculptures, like my mom. So one day I asked him why he was so different. And he told me that he believed in God, so we discussed it many times. And eventually I found out that his belief in God meant that he believed in the Jewish Messiah. And I said, Jewish Messiah? I wish he had come, then there would be no wars. Then I discovered that his Jewish Messiah is what he called Yeshua, which I called Yeshu. And I thought to myself, wow, nothing could be further from the truth. How could such a good, big God who created the universe would reduce himself to becoming a man? And how can such a good man with a golden heart, like Leo, would believe in somebody in whose name so much harm was done in history and so many Jews were murdered in the name of Yeshua? So I tried to prove Leo wrong. We discussed it many times and we argued about it. And every time we argued, he won the argument. And after a while, I thought, I'm wasting my time. This guy is never going to stop believing in this. Plus, he tells me this faith of his gives him peace and joy and purpose for his life. And those were the things I was looking for. So I decided to abandon my crusade to make Leo stop believing. Now I'm jumping ahead to my 12th year in high school. And for my Bible class, I had to write a paper. And the subject of the paper was given to us by the Ministry of Education. And the subject was this: who is the suffering servant of Isaiah 53? And I can't wait to tell you what I learned about this fascinating but often forbidden chapter.